Welcome back. We're picking up on creativity, distortion, and that wild future mindset. Also, the part where success feels less like luck and more like a long bet. Which is annoyingly inspiring, honestly. He keeps saying he was living 10 years ahead, and that is such a strange gift. Or such a strange way to never relax. Exactly like, bro, do you ever sit still? But I get the point that he was escaping a reality that was designed to trap him. That part hit me harder than the success story part. Same, because it is not just ambition, it is survival dressed as ambition. And then he turns that into schools, robotics, computer science, all of it. That is the part people miss when they only talk about celebrity. Fame is the least interesting thing in the room there. He basically looked at the neighborhood and said, "This needs infrastructure, not pity." Yeah, and that is way rarer than motivational quotes. Motivational quotes are cheap, robotics labs are expensive. But I do wonder if living that far ahead makes you lonely sometimes. He kind of admits it does, in his own weird way. Because if your brain is always at 2030, who are you having dinner with tonight? Not your nervous system, apparently. And that is where the whole presence conversation gets messy. He almost argues presence is overrated if your current reality is broken. That is a dangerous thought, but also kind of true. Nobody says be present and stay in the trap. That's actually a terrible wellness slogan. But he is making a bigger point about strategy, not daydreaming. Like, if you know what the future looks like, you should start building now. And he clearly thinks the future is not abstract, it is operational. That is a nice phrase, actually. Write that down before I steal it. The distortion idea is probably the most interesting thing he said, because he is separating emotional noise from real depression, like shaking the table versus breaking the cup. He really loved that cup metaphor. He was absolutely married to that cup, but I think it works because it makes anxiety feel situational, not mystical. He is basically saying, if you know you are future casting, you can manage it. Which is easier said than done when your brain is running 5 tabs ahead. My brain has 12 tabs open and 3 are frozen. But I did like that he refused to romanticize anxiety as creativity. He treats it like a cost, not a badge. That feels more honest than the tortured genius mythology. Yeah, suffering is not a personality. Put that on a t-shirt and sue everyone. Then he goes into how shame and guilt triggered distortion for him. That part is so human, because the harm was not abstract to him. He felt his mother feel it. That is brutal, man. And it explains why his confidence is not just ego. It feels built out of accountability. That is why the femininity conversation matters too. He was basically saying he never had to perform masculinity to be real. Which is still weirdly radical for a lot of people. People act like having softness is a software bug. Meanwhile, it is probably a feature. And he turns that into empathy, which is the larger theme. He talks to strangers because he thinks everyone has something to give. That is rare in someone that famous. Most celebrities talk to strangers only through security. Then the AI section goes completely off the rails in a good way. He is not just saying AI is useful, he is saying it can redistribute power. Especially to kids in places that were already failed by institutions. That is the real argument, not the tech hype. He is furious about zoning, schools, food, literacy, all of it. And he should be. Because AI did not create inequality, people did. AI just showed up to the crime scene. That is cold but accurate. What I loved is he keeps pushing toward agency, not fear. Like, learn the tools, own the tools, build with them. He is almost describing an aspirational GPS for life, which is a wild phrase and somehow it works. But I get it, because he wants systems that help you become, not just consume. And then the ownership stuff gets huge. He is basically asking why our faces and voices are not ours in the AI age. That is such a clean question, and such an uncomfortable one for companies. Companies love ownership when they are the ones doing it. Suddenly everyone is a philosopher when the bill arrives. His point about models building models is where it gets eerie. Because it moves from tool to co-creator to maybe replacement. But he still sounds strangely hopeful about it. Almost dangerously hopeful. You mean the part where he says, bring it? Yeah, because he trusts human intent more than the machine itself. And that is the key tension of the whole conversation. The machine is not the villain, the motive is. Exactly, and that is why the Oppenheimer comparison lands. It is not just can we build it, it is who gets to steer it. And what happens when the smartest system on Earth meets the dumbest human greed? That is a terrible combo meal. That is the fast food menu for civilization. Still, he keeps coming back to love as the operating system, which sounds corny until you actually sit with it. Then it stops sounding corny. Because he is not talking about soft love, he means disciplined love. Love as infrastructure, love as strategy, love as responsibility. That is honestly the cleanest way to sum him up. Particle Man was a crazy answer, though. Bro wanted to control atoms like a DJ. But even that is consistent with everything else he said. Harmony, vibration, intention, all of that is one worldview. And the wild part is he actually lives it. That is what makes it compelling. He is not performing a philosophy, he is defending one. So if we zoom out, this episode was really about building forward without lying to yourself, and about making peace with the fact that growth costs something. But if that cost becomes purpose, it changes everything. That was almost too neat, which means we should probably ruin it. Yeah, let's not get inspirational on Maine. Still, the takeaway is simple enough. The future belongs to people who can feel deeply and still build clearly. That is probably the real superpower. And that feels like a good place to land the series. We survived the future and the Distortion Cup. Big respect to everybody who stayed with us through both episodes. This one is going to sit with me for a while. Same, because it makes success feel less like a rival and more like responsibility, which is a much harder thing to hold. All right, we will leave it there. Until next time, keep your vibes aligned and your tabs closed. Welcome back, because this one is about creativity, distortion, and building for the future. And the wild part is how he makes success sound like duty, not victory. Like he does not talk about winning, he talks about carrying people. Bro moved his whole family and then started building schools like that was the next step. That is not normal success behavior, that is mission mode. And honestly, that is where the whole thing gets interesting. Because most people get money and immediately get smaller. They buy a louder watch and call it legacy. He bought a robotics program and called it Tuesday. But that future thinking thing is not free, and he admitted it. Yeah, like living 10 years ahead sounds cool until your nervous system files a complaint. Your brain is already in 2030, and your body is still loading 2026. And he kept saying that is how he survives, which I get, but there is a cost. The cost is peace sometimes. Or at least the easy version of peace people like to sell online. Right, because he is basically saying presence is not always the goal if survival demanded strategy. That proton-neutron-electron analogy was actually kind of insane. He said if an electron acts like a proton, the atom falls apart, and somehow that made sense. He was saying the self has roles too, not every part of you should act like the same thing. Which is such a clean way to describe why forcing yourself into other people's definitions breaks you. But I still think people use that idea to justify never slowing down. Yes, some people call burnout a personality. They post a sunrise, 2 supplements, and 1 panic attack. But he did make a real distinction between future casting and anxiety. That part was sharp, because he is not saying the future itself is stressful. He is saying stress shows up when you lose control of the frame. That shower versus rain thing was so random that it worked. Somehow, beach underwear became a philosophy lesson, which is honestly how all serious knowledge should arrive. But that distinction matters because people confuse imagination with panic all the time. He is basically saying if you are intentionally looking around the corner, that is not the same as being haunted by it. Though I do think some people romanticize living in the future when really they are avoiding the present. Yeah, that is fair, but for him, the present was apparently a trap at one point. And that is why the whole distortion chapter hit harder than just a mental health story. It sounded like a young man realizing he had hurt his mother. That shame is a huge engine, whether people admit it or not. He said weed was part of it, but the deeper thing was guilt. That is the part everybody skips over when they talk about creativity and addiction. They want the glamorous chaos, not the part where somebody's mother is worried sick. And then he turns distortion into this whole vibrational language. I did not know we were going to a science fantasy monastery today. He basically said depression is the water spilling and distortion is shaking the table, which is actually a useful distinction because one is state and one is disruption. And it makes anxiety feel less like a random curse and more like a pattern you can notice. But you cannot just vibe your way out of every pattern either. No, but awareness changes the game, and that was his point. Then he pivoted to AI like the room had caught fire. From childhood guilt to machine learning in one breath, absolute chaos. I actually loved that he did not treat AI like some abstract billionaire toy. He kept bringing it back to kids, labor, and who gets left behind. That was the real argument, not just whether AI is cool or scary. It was about who built the system, who benefits, and who gets told to adapt. And he is right that the people with the least power are usually the first ones punished by the new wave. He kept saying these neighborhoods were already set up to fail before AI even showed up. That line matters because it refuses the lazy tech saves everything narrative. AI did not create bad schools, bad zoning, bad food access, or bad investment. Humans did that part themselves with excellent consistency. That was dark but painfully accurate. And then he gets almost celebratory about the tool itself, which I think is bold. He is basically saying fear is a luxury of people who have not been crushed yet. The energy was like, bring it on, let's build a better world. Though that optimism is dangerous if it forgets governance. Exactly, because he was also warning that the weapon can outgrow the hand holding it. The Oppenheimer comparison was not subtle at all. He basically said every breakthrough starts as a hammer and ends as a question mark. And the scary part is not the model, it is the intent behind it. Which is why he kept coming back to love versus fear. That part felt almost old school in a weird way. Like he is arguing that if AI is built from fear, it will inherit fear. But if it is built to help people create, maybe the outcome changes. I mean, maybe. But technology usually reflects whoever owns the switch. Which is why everyone suddenly loves ethics when the market gets loud. Facts. And then he went even bigger with ownership of likeness and data. That was one of the smartest parts of the whole conversation. He is asking why your face, voice, searches, and behavior are not yours. That Drake AI, Biggie, Tupac example was wild because he made it sound normal. And that is the point. It should not be normal that identity gets copied like a logo. He basically wants a world where people own their data the way artists own their songs. But even that is more radical than it sounds, because it changes power completely. Yeah, if the user owns the key, the platform is no longer the landlord. And landlords hate that. I think that is why his whole pitch around FYI felt bigger than productivity. It was less app, more infrastructure for agency. He is not just asking how people work faster, he is asking who controls the work. That is the real future question, not whether the interface looks clean. And then you have the schools angle, which brings it back to the kids immediately. He is saying these kids need skills, not just access to an expensive campus someday. Robotics, coding, project-based learning, actual leverage. Not just debt with a nice font on it. That should be on a billboard somewhere. And the funniest thing is he made the future sound both terrifying and extremely practical. Like, this is not just philosophy, this is curriculum. I think that is why he comes off as so intense. He is carrying a lot of people in his head at once. And yet he still ends up talking about love as the final operating system. Particle Man was ridiculous, but also kind of beautiful. It sounds goofy until you realize he means harmony at the deepest level. Although I do think the superhero answer was a little too perfect. Of course, the man with a future empire wants to be made of particles. That is such an annoying answer, but I respect it. Because even the superpower is just another way of saying he wants to tune the world. And maybe that is the whole episode in one sentence. A creative mind is not just trying to make things, it is trying to repair frequency. That is a lot to ask from one person, especially when they are also supposed to be successful, calm, and emotionally available. The modern man has a terrible job description. But the mother piece matters too, because so much of his discipline sounds inherited. His whole worldview seems built from being loved hard and corrected hard, which is probably why he can talk about ambition without sounding hollow. He does not sound motivated by clout at all. He sounds like someone who would absolutely skip a trophy ceremony to fix a neighborhood. That is very specific and somehow accurate, and I think that is the closing thought for me. The episode is really about what you do with a gift once you know you have it. Do you protect it or do you pass it on? He clearly thinks passing it on is the only responsible answer. And that is a perfect place to end the series. Big love to everyone who stayed with us for both episodes. This one had creativity, fear, AI, identity, and a lot of heart. Next time we are definitely arguing about something easier. Probably not, but we can dream. All right, we will leave it there. Until next time, keep your vibes aligned and your tabs closed. Welcome back. We are still in this future brain rabbit hole. This one is about distortion, creativity, and why building for later can break your present. And then it gets wild with AI, identity, and who actually owns your face. Which is a deeply normal sentence to say on a podcast, obviously. No, but the future thing is actually mad because he really lives there. I know, and part of me is like, wait, is that wisdom or just coping? That's the tension, right? Because he says he had to leave reality to escape reality. That sounds insane until you remember where he came from. When your current environment is built to shrink you, fantasy starts looking practical. Bro, he basically turned manifestation into project management. That's the funniest and most accurate way to say it. And it worked, because the foundation stuff wasn't abstract at all. He didn't just say, believe in yourself, he built robotics and computer science programs. That's the part I love, because it is not inspirational wallpaper energy. Nobody got saved by a motivational poster hanging in a classroom. He saw the gap, then brought actual tools into the neighborhood. And the thing is, that future logic was not even wrong. He was saying the jobs would vanish before people were ready, which is terrifying because he said that before all this AI panic got mainstream. That's what hit me too, because he sounded early, not dramatic. And then he goes straight into inner-city kids needing access to the wave. That part mattered, because he keeps blaming systems, not brains. Which is rare because people love pretending the problem is laziness. Right, and he is like, no, the zoning, the schools, the food, the money literacy. He just names the whole machine. And then he flips it into a tool conversation instead of a doom conversation. Which is harder, honestly. Way harder because doom is lazy and tool thinking requires responsibility. He is basically saying AI is not the villain, people are. Yeah, and that distinction is everything. The whole time he's like, the hammer is not evil, the hand is. And then he starts bringing up Star Wars like a man who has fully committed. But I kind of loved it because he is not scared of optimism. He thinks fear is the wrong operating system. Do you buy that, though? I buy part of it, but I also think fear is useful when it keeps you honest. Like, if a model can write songs and make images and clone voices, you should be nervous. Not panic, but nervous enough to ask who controls it. Exactly, and that's where his ownership point gets spicy. The face, the voice, the data, the likeness, all of it. He is basically arguing that people should own their digital self the way they own property. And that is not some tiny product feature. That is a civilizational argument. Most companies would faint hearing that sentence. They'd be like, please stop asking for your own face. But he is right that we already accept weird ownership asymmetries. Like, why can a label own the recording, but a person cannot fully own their likeness? That is the kind of question that gets ignored until it becomes a lawsuit. Or until it becomes too late and everyone's voice is a commodity. And then the whole critique of AI shifts from fear to power. That's the real thing, right? Who gets leverage and who gets replaced. He was so animated talking about this because he sees the upside too. He thinks tomorrow's kids can build their own models and own their own companies. Which is massive if a compute gets cheaper and the gatekeeping drops. Imagine some teenager in 2030 just casually training a model in a bedroom. And then some whole industry gets embarrassed by a kid with a laptop. That is why his point about preparation matters more than inspiration. Information, inspiration, preparation, motivation, mentorship. It's a whole chain, not a vibe. Which is annoying because the internet loves a vibe and hates a system. Can we talk about the distortion part too? Because that was weirdly beautiful. The water cup and shaking the table thing was actually a good metaphor. Even if he went full science poet halfway through it. Yeah, he absolutely did. But the idea is clear. Depression is one thing, distortion is another. He is saying distortion is when your vibration gets knocked off balance, which I think is his way of naming shame, guilt, panic, all of that. Especially when he talked about being young and smoking weed and hurting his mom. That part felt really human because the theory suddenly had a wound underneath it. And he connected that to sensitivity, which I think creative people try to deny. Everyone wants to act like being hypersensitive is a brand. Until they have one bad week and start talking like a monk. Exactly. Then suddenly everybody is on a healing journey. But he was honest that feeling too much can become a real burden. Still, he doesn't treat it like a defect. He treats it like the cost of perception. And that is such a good line because it reframes the whole thing. It also explains why he keeps talking about 10 years ahead. He is not detached, he is oriented. That sounds like a very expensive therapy sentence. Put that on a mug and charge $80. But genuinely, I think his answer to peace is purpose. He keeps saying the future gets lighter when it has a task. Maybe, but sometimes purpose can also become a trap. If you are always building, you never arrive. And that circles back to presence, which is the whole spiritual complaint. He kind of admits he is not fully harmonious right now. That honesty matters to me more than the theory. Because he is not pretending success deleted struggle. He literally has Grammys, Super Bowls, all that, and still says no. No to perfection, no to pretending, no to emotional fake peace. Which is refreshing, because rich people often sound like they levitated out of reality. Like, congratulations, you found a meditation cushion. He did not do that. He stayed messy and thoughtful. And that is probably why the conversation worked so well. He is not selling calm, he is selling responsibility. Which is a much harder product, honestly. Calm is easy to market. Responsibility is terrible for margins. That's crazy, but yes. I also loved the part where he talked about passing on knowledge. That was the emotional center of the whole thing. Because he could have framed success as personal victory, but he didn't. He framed it as obligation to family, kids, and the neighborhood. That is way bigger than flex culture. Flex culture would never survive one honest conversation like this. So final verdict, are we pro-future brain or anti-future brain? I am pro-future brain with a seatbelt. Same, because the vision is powerful, but the ethics have to grow with it. And maybe that is the whole lesson from this episode. Build like the future is real, but do not abandon the people in the room. That is a clean place to land this series. We went from creativity to AI rights to particle superpowers, which is absurd. But somehow it all held together. Because at the center of it was always love, really. Yeah, and that is a pretty good note to end on. Big love to everyone who rode with us through both episodes. Hopefully your brain is only moderately fried. Go build something useful, be decent to people, and keep thinking ahead. All right, we will leave it there.